Watch it, old man. The shove came fast, sharp, deliberate. Harold Reeves, 91, stumbled off the curb and into the street. Cars screeched, horns screamed. But somehow, the old Marine caught his balance just before disaster. His cane clattered to the pavement. His chest rose with breath, not fear, but fury. The teenagers just laughed, high-fiving like they'd scored a win. They didn't know who he was. Didn't care what battles he'd fought, what brothers he'd lost. They just saw an old man. And as they swaggered into a nearby alley, still proud of their cruelty, they didn't notice the call he made, didn't hear the boots coming. Minutes later, that same alley fell silent, its entrance blocked by two Marines in dress blues. And behind them came the sound every recruit learns to fear, the steady, thunderous rhythm of marching boots. Harold Reeves had the kind of presence that didn't announce itself, but rather settled quietly into a room. At 91 years old, his back was a little hunched, and his walk had slowed to a patient rhythm, aided by a cane worn smooth by years of use. But his eyes, sharp, clear, and steady, still held the intensity of a man who had stared down enemies in 3 wars, and lived to tell about it, even if he rarely did. He lived alone in a modest apartment on the quiet side of Asheville, North Carolina. The kind of place where neighbors still nodded in greeting, where kids bike without helmets, and where the smell of fresh bread from the old Dutch bakery still floated down Main Street every morning. Harold liked that. He didn't need much. Never had a pension check, a worn recliner, a shelf full of faded books, and a small black and white photo on his nightstand. In it, a much younger man in a crisp Marine uniform held his wife Caroline close on their wedding day, just days before he shipped off to Okinawa. She'd passed 20 years earlier, but Harold still talked to her sometimes, quietly, usually while sipping black coffee by the window, the early morning light just catching the frame. He never remarried. Some men are wired to move on. Harold wasn't one of them. Each day followed a kind of sacred pattern. He'd rise before sunrise, old habits from his military days never truly fading. He'd press his slacks even though no one was looking. He'd polish his shoes, tie his sweater, and pin a small Marine Corps lapel pin to his collar. Then he'd make the same walk he had for over a decade down to the library on Chestnut Street. The librarians knew him by name, always greeted him with warmth. Harold liked the history section, especially biographies. He had read nearly every book about the men he once served under, some of whom never came home. After the library, he'd stroll over to the bakery where the owner, a kindly woman named Joan, would always have a lemon bar set aside for him. For Mr. Reeves, she'd say with a wink. He never made a fuss, just paid with cash and left a folded dollar for the tip jar. Sometimes he'd sit in the park for an hour, just watching the ducks, the clouds, children playing in the distance, a small ritual of gratitude. After everything he'd seen in Korea, in the jungles of Vietnam and the beaches of the Pacific, peace wasn't something he took for granted. It was a privilege. And every quiet moment, every uneventful afternoon felt like a treasure earned. Harold Reeves never asked for recognition, never told people about his medals. He kept his stories folded away like the flag in his closet, neatly, reverently. All he wanted now was peace and just a little dignity. But as the world would soon be reminded, even the quietest men still carry thunder in their bones. In most small towns, there's always a group of kids who grow up with too little discipline and too much time on their hands. In downtown Asheville, that group took the form of 4 teenage boys, loud, restless, and always hanging around the bakery corner or the park benches outside the old post office. Locals knew them by sight, if not by name. Backward hats, sagging jeans, always glued to their phones or mocking passers-by in low, cruel tones. They weren't dangerous in the traditional sense, just careless, arrogant, and completely untethered from respect. Storefront owners often sighed when they saw them approach. They left empty soda cups on windowsills, cursed loudly within earshot of children, and carved nonsense into park benches with pocket knives. Tourists ignored them, but older residents quietly crossed the street to avoid a confrontation. That was just easier, quieter, safer. But Harold Reeves didn't cross the street, not because he was brave, not because he wanted a fight, simply because it wasn't in his nature to walk away from a straight path. If there was something in the way, you addressed it. That was how he was raised. That was how he trained men to fight. And that was how he intended to live the remainder of his days. It was a calm, overcast afternoon when it happened. The wind carried the scent of sugar and cinnamon from the bakery, and the sidewalk still shimmered faintly from a light morning rain. Harold had finished his library visit, and was on his way to get a small indulgence, his weekly lemon bar. It was the only sweet he ever treated himself to, not just for the taste, but for the memory. Caroline used to bake them back when the world was louder, and their house still rang with life. As he turned the corner, Harold spotted the group sprawled across the bakery bench, legs stretched out, voices too loud. One was flicking a cigarette but onto the pavement. Another was laughing at something on his phone. They were blocking the walkway entirely, forcing every passerby to step off the curb into the street. Harold stopped. He adjusted the grip on his cane. He didn't glare. He didn't curse. He just did what any decent man might do in a decent town. He walked forward and said, "Excuse me, boys. May I pass?" What happened next would ripple far beyond that narrow sidewalk. "Excuse me, boys, may I pass?" Harold's voice was calm, steady, the same voice he'd once used to instruct young Marines under fire, only quieter now with age. He didn't demand. He didn't threaten. He simply asked. The teens looked up, amused, indifferent. The leader, a lanky boy with an oversized hoodie and smug eyes, glanced Harold up and down with mock curiosity. Well, he said, standing up. "Look who's out past nap time." The others chuckled. One of them took a loud slurp from a fast food cup and shook the ice around like it was funny. Another leaned back, stretching his legs even farther across the sidewalk. Harold didn't react. He just waited. "What's the rush, old-timer?" the first boy asked, folding his arms. "You going to storm Normandy again, or just the bakery?" "Just the bakery," Harold said plainly. "If you don't mind moving your feet." "Mind?" the boy grinned wide. "Yeah, I think we do mind. This is our spot. Find another route, Grandpa." Harold shifted his weight slightly, leaning on his cane. "You don't own the sidewalk." That struck a nerve. The boy's grin faded, his ego fragile and inflated. Didn't like being told no, especially not by someone who looked like a walking antique. "You want respect?" the teen sneered. "Maybe you should show some to your betters." With that, he moved suddenly, sticking out a foot while giving Harold a sharp shove to the shoulder. It was a cruel, calculated move, just enough to unbalance the old man, but not so much that he could be blamed outright. Harold's cane slipped. His shoes scraped the edge of the curb and in an instant he was stumbling forward, arms flailing into the street. A horn blared, tires screeched. A red sedan swerved hard, barely missing him by a foot. Harold twisted his body just enough to avoid hitting the pavement full force, landing against the side of a parked car instead. His shoulder throbbed. His cane clattered to the ground. The teens roared with laughter. "Yo, did you see him jump?" one of them shouted like a cartoon character. Another mimicked the stumble, pretending to fall. They slapped hands, still amused by their own malice, and turned away, vanishing down a nearby alley as if nothing had happened. Harold didn't move at first. His chest rose and fell, not from exhaustion, but from the steady burn of something older than anger. Humiliation, cold and bitter. A woman hurried over, middle-aged, hair in a loose bun, clutching a grocery bag in one arm. "Oh my God, sir, are you okay?" she gasped, crouching to help him retrieve the cane. Harold nodded, still catching his breath. "Just startled," he murmured. "Nothing broken." She looked toward the alley where the teens had disappeared and shook her head in disgust. "Disgraceful. Just disgraceful. What is wrong with kids these days?" He didn't answer. The words wouldn't have helped. He'd served with men who died for the right of those boys to laugh in safety. He'd carried brothers out of jungle fire. And now here he was, shoved into the street by children who wouldn't survive a day in the world he once knew. His hip ached, his palms were scraped, and his appetite was gone. He straightened himself slowly, thanked the woman for her help, and brushed off his coat. It wasn't the physical pain that lingered. It was the look in their eyes, amusement, not even malice. As if his life meant so little. It was just another joke. Harold had always believed respect was something earned. He'd spent a lifetime earning it, but now he was starting to realize some people never learn to give it. Harold stood at the edge of the sidewalk, hand resting on the head of his cane, heart still pounding, not from exertion, but from something colder, deeper. He watched the alley for a moment longer where the teens had disappeared. Their laughter had faded, but the echo of it still rang in his ears. He could have just gone home. That would have been the easier thing to do. Hobble the 4 blocks back to his apartment, pour a stiff drink, and try to forget it happened. But Harold Reeves had never been one to walk away from disrespect. Not in Okinawa, not in Incheon, not in Danone, and not here on a sidewalk in Asheville with lemon bar crumbs and shattered dignity underfoot. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a phone that had seen better days. The screen was scratched, the numbers small, but his hand was steady. He scrolled through the few contacts he had stored, mostly doctors' offices, the library, and one that simply read recruiting office. Harold tapped the number and held the phone to his ear. It rang twice before someone picked up. United States Marine Corps Recruiting Station, Asheville. This is Sergeant Kelly speaking. How can I help you? Harold's voice was calm, but carried the tone of authority that never quite faded from a senior NCO. This is Master Gunnery Sergeant Harold Reeves. Retired. I need to speak with Staff Sergeant Alvarez. There was a pause. Then the voice on the other end sharpened. Yes, sir. One moment. Harold heard the click of the call being transferred. Then the low murmur of voices in the background. The sound of boots on tile. A door creaking open. Then a new voice came through. Gruff, alert, and familiar. Alvarez here? Staff Sergeant? It's Master Gunnery Sergeant Reeves. Sir, Master Gunny, Alvarez replied instantly, the tone in his voice switching to full attention. It's an honor, sir. What can I do for you? Harold wasted no time. I've got a situation. Just now, I was shoved into traffic by a group of local teens. No injury, but they showed deliberate disrespect. Mocked my service. Laughed when I nearly fell under a car. Alvarez didn't interrupt. They're holed up in the alley behind the bakery off Elm Street. 4 of them, loud, cocky, and unbothered. This wasn't just mischief. This was personal. Another pause. Then Alvarez's voice lowered, each word clipped and precise. Understood, Master Gunny. We'll take it from here. Harold nodded, though Alvarez couldn't see it. Make sure they understand what it means when they cross a line with a Marine. Yes, sir. We'll handle it. You stay clear of that alley, Master Gunnery Sergeant. I will. I've already done my part. And with that, Harold ended the call. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just slipped the phone back into his coat pocket and turned toward a nearby bench with a clear view of the alley entrance. His hips still throbbed. His dignity still stung, but he sat down slowly, placed both hands on top his cane, and waited, not for revenge, but for something far more satisfying. Justice, delivered the Marine Corps way. Staff Sergeant Miguel Alvarez didn't hesitate. The moment the call ended, he was already moving. His boots echoed down the polished tile of the recruiting station as he pushed open the door to the common room where a handful of Marines and new recruits were finishing up paperwork and training schedules. He scanned the room, his expression tight, his jaw clenched, but his voice steady. Form up now. We've got a problem. The chatter stopped immediately. Among the men in the room were 2 active duty recruiters in uniform, Sergeant Hensley and Corporal Banks, and 5 pulleys, young recruits set to ship out to Paris Island in the coming weeks. They weren't Marines yet, but they were hungry to prove themselves. Alvarez looked each of them in the eye as they lined up. Listen up, he said, voice low and firm. A retired Master Gunnery Sergeant, Harold Reeves, was assaulted today, shoved into traffic by 4 teenagers right here in this town. Mocked for his age, mocked for his service. A quiet wave of outrage swept through the group. He didn't call the cops, he called us. Alvarez let that sit for a moment. He expects us to remind these punks what the uniform means. Not with fists, with presence. With discipline, with respect. Sergeant Hensley nodded. Where? Alley behind the bakery, off Elm Street. Let's move. They were dressed in various uniforms. Alvarez and Hensley in Service Charlies, Corporal Banks in Woodland camis. The pulleys, though still civilians, wore their USMC PT gear proudly. And while they hadn't yet earned the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor, today they'd learn firsthand what the Corps stood for. The group stepped outside in formation, boots hitting the pavement with synchronized force. They didn't run. They didn't shout. They moved with the kind of quiet resolve that made bystanders pause and watch. People on sidewalks turned their heads. Business owners stepped outside. Car doors froze mid-close. Something about the way they marched, not hurried, not aggressive, but locked in, made the street hold its breath. Harold, watching from the bench across the street, didn't move. He just gripped the head of his cane and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod as the unit passed. The Marines rounded the corner and stopped at the mouth of the alley. 2 Marines stayed behind to block the exit. Alvarez and the rest entered without a word. Inside the alley, the teens were still there, laughing, checking their phones, shoving each other over something trivial. They didn't even look up at first, but then one of them caught the polished toe of a dress shoe. Then another saw the white belt, and then all at once, the boys stood frozen, their laughter swallowed by the sudden, sobering presence of 8 silent, unmoving figures. They didn't know who these men were, but they knew instinctively, in the way that even the cockiest teenager can feel when the mood turns, that they had made a mistake. A big one. And the Marines hadn't even spoken a word yet. The first sound that reached the teenagers wasn't shouting. It wasn't sirens. It was boots. Heavy, rhythmic, steady. A sound they couldn't quite place until it got closer, until the pattern of it filled the narrow alley like a drumbeat of authority. The laughter died. The tallest boy, the same one who had shoved Harold, turned his head toward the alley's mouth. He squinted, then frowned. Standing at the entrance, shoulder to shoulder, were 2 Marines in full dress blues, imposing, motionless, faces expressionless, hands behind their backs, blocking the only way out. Behind them came 6 more figures, led by a shark-jawed man in a green uniform whose presence alone could silence a room. His walk wasn't hurried, his posture was intense, but he moved with intent, and each step of his boots echoed like a warning bell. Staff Sergeant Miguel Alvarez didn't need to speak right away. He just let the silence do the work. The teens stood frozen. Suddenly, they looked younger, smaller. The one who had done the shoving shifted nervously, as if trying to stand taller, unsure if he should run or speak. Alvarez stepped forward, stopping just a few feet in front of them. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Gentlemen," he began, his tone cool and even. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" The boys said nothing. Their bravado had drained from their faces. "You put a 91-year-old man into traffic," Alvarez continued. "A man who fought in 3 wars so you could grow up safe enough to mock him." Still no answer. "You shoved a Marine." His voice dropped, slower now. "A master gunnery sergeant. Do you even know what that means?" "That's a title earned over decades, built on sacrifice, leadership, discipline. It's not just a rank. It's a life, a legacy. And you treated him like trash." The smallest of the boys opened his mouth as if to respond, but Alvarez held up a hand. "No excuses. Not today." He looked each one of them in the eye, one by one, locking them in place with a gaze sharper than a bayonet. "You think you're tough? You think knocking down an old man makes you strong?" Alvarez shook his head slowly. "Strength isn't measured by how loud you talk or how many followers you've got on that little screen in your pocket." He took a single step closer. "Strength is showing respect when no one's watching. It's holding your ground for the right reasons. It's understanding what men like Harold Reeves endured so you wouldn't have to." The silence was deafening. Alvarez paused, then motioned to the pulleys behind him. These young men behind me, they signed up to serve, and every one of them just got a front row lesson in what dishonor looks like and what it feels like to stand in front of it. He straightened. You owe that man an apology, and you owe yourselves something more, a hard look in the mirror. No threats, no yelling, just truth. Cold, clear, and impossible to run from. Then he stepped back and turned without another word. The Marines behind him did the same. They didn't shove, didn't posture. They simply turned their backs because the lesson had already landed. The boys stood in place, pale and stunned, as if the weight of everything they just heard had wrapped itself around their shoulders like sandbags. And outside the alley, seated calmly on a park bench across the street, Harold Reeves watched, his cane across his lap and a faint, almost invisible smile just beginning to form. When the teens finally stepped out of the alley, they didn't look anything like the arrogant boys who had strutted in just minutes earlier. Gone were the swaggering shoulders and smug grins. Their heads hung low, their faces pale, and their movements slow and unsure, like men who had walked through a storm and come out the other side soaked not in water but in shame. They didn't speak. They didn't dare look up. People on the street who had paused to watch now stood in stunned silence. A small crowd had gathered, not by design, but drawn by curiosity by the sudden appearance of uniformed Marines marching into a back alley in full formation. Some had witnessed the initial shove. Others had simply followed the tension in the air. Now they stood by storefronts and sidewalks, watching the transformation unfold before their eyes. The first teen exited the alley with his hands stuffed in his pockets, face burning. The second glanced nervously over his shoulder, as if half expecting one of the Marines to follow him out. The third wiped at his eyes, clearly trying not to cry. And the last, the one who had shoved Harold, walked the slowest. He looked back once and caught sight of the old man sitting quietly across the street. Harold didn't wave, didn't smirk. He just watched, calm and upright like a statue of the past, quietly reminding the present of where it came from. The teens turned down the sidewalk and disappeared. But the crowd remained. Someone clapped once, then another. And then it spread, not like wild applause, but like a quiet ripple of respect. Not for the boys, not even for the Marines, who had already started marching back toward the recruitment station with silent purpose, but for what it all meant. Word spread quickly through Asheville. By dinner time, the story had made it to the cafe near the courthouse, the community center, the old VFW hall. Did you hear what happened behind the bakery? Was whispered with the same tone people used when they talk about local legends. Photos circulated, taken from phones across the street, of the Marines lined up in front of the alley, of Harold seated on the bench like a forgotten general finally being seen again. At the grocery store, people pointed and nodded respectfully as Harold passed. At the bakery, Joan gave him 2 lemon bars the next morning. On the house, she said, trying to hide her watery eyes. Teenagers in the area suddenly found new manners. Sidewalks were clearer. Doors were held open. Elders were greeted with sir and ma'am. And somewhere deep in that quiet town, the memory of one afternoon's reckoning etched itself into the local fabric. Not as an act of vengeance, but as a reminder. That respect isn't just taught. Sometimes it's enforced. And when Marines walk in silence, the world listens. Something shifted after that day. Not just in the alley, not just in the hearts of those 4 teenagers, but in the town itself. The boys weren't seen hanging around the bakery anymore. They didn't loiter outside the post office or shout at cars from the park benches. In fact, they kept a lower profile altogether. When they did walk through town, their heads were down, not out of fear, but out of something much heavier, understanding. And people noticed. One of them, Thomas, the tallest and loudest, started showing up early at the library. Not to cause trouble, but to help the staff unload boxes of donated books. Another, Jake, asked his parents if he could volunteer at the community center. He didn't tell them why. He just said, "I need to do something better with my time." Harold Reeves never spoke of the incident publicly. He didn't write letters, didn't give interviews. When neighbors tried to thank him for what he'd endured, what he'd started, he'd simply nod and say, "It was handled." But his walks changed. Where once people glanced past him, just another old man with a cane, now they looked him in the eye. They smiled, tipped their hats. A few even greeted him the Marine way with a firm "sir," followed by a handshake or a subtle salute. Even the younger folks began to take notice. Teenagers, usually absorbed in their phones, stepped aside to let him pass. Some even muttered, "Sir." He never made a fuss, never demanded that respect. He just accepted it quietly, like the medals he never wore or the folded flag tucked in his bedroom closet. One afternoon, about a week after the alley, Harold made his usual stop at the bakery. Joan was there behind the counter, flour on her apron, eyes already misty when she saw him walk in. "Your table's ready," she said with a smile. Harold chuckled softly. "Just here for one thing." She reached behind the counter and pulled out a small white box already tied with a red ribbon. "You earned 2 this week," she whispered. He sat by the window, same as always, and took a small bite of the lemon bar. It tasted just the way he remembered, sweet, bright, with a little sharpness at the end. Outside, a breeze rustled the flag on the library's front lawn. Across the street, the Marine recruiting station's door opened briefly, and a young man in uniform stepped out, spotted Harold, and nodded in his direction. Harold nodded back, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a relic. He felt like a Marine again, like the uniform still fit even without wearing it. The afternoon sun poured gently over the sidewalks of Asheville, casting long golden streaks across the brick buildings. The town moved at its usual slow pace, shop doors chiming open, voices murmuring over coffee, children laughing in the distance. Harold Reeves walked with his usual rhythm, cane in one hand, the other resting in his coat pocket. His steps were deliberate, but not labored. He had regained something since that day in the alley. Not youth, not strength, but presence. He wasn't invisible anymore. As he passed the Marine Corps recruitment office, he didn't expect anything. He wasn't the kind of man who needed gestures. He'd simply nod and keep moving as he always did. But today was different. The door swung open. Staff Sergeant Miguel Alvarez stepped out, dressed in his uniform, standing tall. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He simply brought his right hand to his brow and delivered a salute, sharp, perfect, and full of meaning. Harold stopped. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he straightened just enough and returned the salute with slow, measured dignity. No words were exchanged. None were needed. 2 Marines, 2 generations, 1 bond. As Harold turned and continued on his walk, the corner of his mouth lifted, not in amusement, but in quiet peace. His service hadn't been forgotten. His sacrifice hadn't been lost in time. Not in this town. Not anymore. In a world where attention spans grow shorter and headlines change by the hour, stories like Harold Reeves's remind us of something deeper, something enduring. They remind us that respect is timeless, that dignity doesn't retire with age, and that a quiet man with a cane can still carry the weight of a nation's values in every step he takes. Maybe you've seen it in your own town. An older man at the diner, sitting alone in silence. A woman with a veteran's patch on her jacket, ignored as people rushed past. Moments where a little kindness, a little recognition could have changed everything. So, here's a question for you. What would you have done if you were in that alley? Would you have stepped in, walked away, or maybe made the call Harold did? And more importantly, what would our world look like if we all stood up for one another like those Marines did? Let's talk about it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed or experienced something similar? What does honor look like to you in today's world? We'd love to hear your stories. If this touched you, if it reminded you of someone you know, a grandfather, a friend, a Marine, please consider liking the video, subscribing, and sharing this story because these are the stories that deserve to be remembered. These are the moments that bring us back to who we are as a people. Thank you for watching, brought to you by Valor Stories.